We find ourselves now in a situation where the major cities, the major Democrat big cities in this country, are not siding with law, order, and the Constitution. They're not siding with federal control of the feds having the ability to put down insurrection. I'm Dr. Duke, and this is Constitution Corner. Well, friends out there, it's amazing how thin the line is between what's constitutional and what's not, and what the constitutional format of our country allows us to consider and not to consider. I want to give you an example of how tough some of these constitutional questions are with the rioting going on the streets right now. Ever since George Floyd was murdered, and I think every good person of goodwill can point out that was a bridge too far, that there's nobody that I know who defends what happened with Floyd, even though it's a complicated story. Fact remains is that has become an excuse, not just for valid American protests about systemic issues. It has been hijacked by Black Lives Matter radicals, by Antifa radicals, and we know that the vandalism, the graffiti, the violence, the attempted murder in some cases, the taking over of police precincts, the taking over of city blocks of cities, as in Seattle with CHOP, this is beyond the pale. There is no time in American history where we have sat back and let that happen without a response. And generally speaking, throughout our history, the cities have responded. You think about the riots in the 60s, you didn't have cities en masse siding with the protesters, refusing to enforce law and order, cops being told to stand down. In instances like that, or even go back to the early 60s with the civil rights movement, and you had Selma, right, where the only way some of those schools were going to be integrated is if federal entities entered into the states to do that. That was very controversial at the time, but in retrospect, I think most people would say that it was a useful thing. It was a necessary thing. We find ourselves now in a situation where the major cities, the major Democrat big cities in this country, are not siding with law, order, and the Constitution. They're not siding with federal control of the feds having the ability to put down insurrection. Matter of fact, what's happening is these Democrat politicians, in collusion with a bought and paid for media, are actually defending what the protesters are doing. It's not rioting, it's not vandalism on the one hand, or in those instances where it obviously is, well, these are legitimate forms of protest. We've heard this from Nancy Pelosi, we've heard this from the mayor of Seattle, that the progressive left will not admit that even vandalism, violence, the taking over of the toppling of monuments, the taking over of buildings and city blocks, according to the progressives like the mayor of Seattle, these are peaceful protests. And that's the problem that we have right now. The American people are being told by the leaders of these cities that even violence is peaceful if you're doing it for progressive causes. Meanwhile, Donald Trump has recognized it. He said this, to be fair to Trump, he said this for years now. If you won't, at the state and city level, get your act together, if you won't protect private property and protect federal property and land in your states and cities, the federal government has not just a moral obligation, they have a constitutional mandate to protect that. And we're seeing now progressive mayors of places like Portland and Seattle and Chicago howling in indignation because in Portland, Donald Trump has sent federal agents to arrest people who on film have engaged in clearly violent and unconstitutional kinds of rebellion. You can't call it protest anymore. Our country's history, our founding documents are absolutely clear about this. But think about how razor thin the constitutional connection here is. Certainly nobody on my side, nobody who I know wants a federally armed, federally funded police force going into cities and dragging people out. That's not American values. But by the other hand, when cities and states refuse to enforce law and order, especially with regards to federal buildings and federal land, somebody has to do it. There's a constitutional obligation for the federal government to step in, as they did in Selma, right, to get those little black girls into Alabama schools. It was necessary. It's interesting to me how the progressives ignore that. That was considered a hallmark of American life. When John F. Kennedy, when the early 60s Kennedy-Johnson ticket sent the feds in to make sure black Americans, children could go to school. The liberals loved that, as they should. It was a great moment in Western culture, I believe, in terms of there was no other way around that. And yet now, where you have something as bad or perhaps worse going on now, the kind of beatings, the kind of violence, the kind of threats, the kind of cultural erasure that's taking place, suddenly the progressives have lost their tolerance or their recognition that there is a time constitutionally when the federal government will have to pick up and do what the states and cities won't do. And it's an interesting thing that Donald Trump has done it. I mean, it takes a lot of courage to do what Trump has done, to actually start following through on the threats that he's made to people like the mayor of Chicago. Another huge massacre weekend there, 60, 70 people shot, huge shooting outside a funeral home, and the Chicago mayor does nothing but scream bloody murder that Donald Trump might do what she refuses to do, and that's simply protect the constitutional rights of people to live in freedom and safety. That's how serious our constitutional values are on the line. This has been the Liberty News Hour. As always, you can go to thenewamerican.com and jbs.org for more information on these topics and more shows.